And we are live.
Welcome.
Welcome to Explore Simplexity.
So today we're going to be talking about language. We're going to talk about the history of language. We're going to talk a little bit about cognitive science, and we're going to talk a little bit about metaphors and meaning. So the scientific and maybe a little bit of the artistic and mystical aspects of language.
Yeah, but also just like some fundamental ideas of just to start off with, like what is language? What constitutes language than just communication? Like, I don't know. I think language might be something specifically different than just seeing like a red apple and seeing this is a food. It's just like a sensory stimulus that's giving you some information. The apple isn't communicating to you. I mean, I don't know, maybe it is. And that's kind of why I wanted to open it up. Like, where do we draw the boundaries between language and just understanding our environment and what those things mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's definitely signals in terms of. So one is perception, right? What's there and you perceive it. And I think that's what you're talking about with the apple, right? It doesn't send you messages, but you perceive the apple. And I think communication implies some sort of intent, like whether it's like a mating pheromones or there's some sort of signal that has an intention with a communication. So there's a sender and a receiver. And language is special in the sense that there are words, and these words are like boxes with meaning.
Okay. So, yeah, that's getting kind of further down the line than I'm thinking right now. I kind of want to stick with this apple metaphor or idea because, maybe the apple is telling us something. And evolutionarily, right, the idea is when an apple is red, the skin changes pigment specifically to communicate to humans or other people who are going to eat it that I'm sweet, I taste good, and my seeds are ready. And I need you to eat me so that you'll carry my seeds somewhere else. So maybe the apple found a way to communicate to its environment.
Yeah, and there's a weird like synergy of like, did humans evolve color vision or did fruits evolve color, or maybe it was at the same time?
That happens all the time. Parallel evolution, where you have these symbiotic kind of relationships. But I don't know. So is that kind of signal where the genes of the apple tree or any kind of fruit, strawberries, develop this pigmentation change to communicate with organisms? Is that language? To me, I think it's probably not. I think that's a big stretch. But it's more than just communication. And what I'm saying is that even the apple's pigment or the strawberry's pigment could be a form of communication. Interesting thought.
I would call it signal or perception only because for me, communication implies intent.
Okay. So there needs to be some kind of conscious awareness.
Yeah. So like a communication means, there's a sender and then there's a receiver. And it doesn't even have to be like conscious in the sense of like human awareness or consciousness. Like you have birds that have mating calls, which is a sort of signal saying like, hey, I'm ready to mate. And it's sent to a specific target that they hear it, receive it, and then they respond.
So that call would be language, or that be a
No,
signal?
it's a communication.
Yeah. Okay. Right. That's very similar to the Apple thing. That's a much slower time scale unless you have or like if you have like pheromones that are being sent out. These are just environmental cues, I guess, rather than a language. So maybe could we think of language as being more of interactive? Is that necessary, or have some kind of dialogue? Back and forth?
Yeah, I think there's a mutual understanding, there's dialogue, and there's also words. I think words are important. Yeah, and people loosely use language as a metaphor. So, for example, when I teach math, I treat it like it's a language. And it's an analogy because there's no words in math. It's all symbols and numbers. But the analogy is that there's something like a grammar where there's a structure to it and it's intelligible and you can make sense of it, but it's not technically a language.
Yeah. Or like if we just get into like interpersonal communication, like body language, right?
Right. Also not
So far,
a language.
Right. So far as we've defined it, body language is not necessarily a language.
Right.
It's just
That's an analogy.
a signal, a contextual signal that can guide maybe the conversation or get some kind of flavor to what the words that are occurring are.
Yeah. No. So this is, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but it seems like a good segue into metaphors, because metaphors. So by the way, if you haven't read this book, Metaphors We Live By, I highly, highly recommend this book. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, they get into cognitive science and like the beginnings of cognitive science. And they talk about metaphors as being important in communication, as well as art and dreams and other things. So metaphors historically go forward, meaning if you have something new and you're trying to figure out or describe what it is, people will typically use a metaphor to describe something new. So this is a fun historical example. So Beowulf, that's a name, and it actually means bear. So Beowulf means bear, and it comes from Beowulf. So you can imagine these people have a word for bee and they have a word for wolf. And what's that thing? Well, it's sort of like a wolf that likes honey. And once you understand, oh yeah, the wolf thing that likes honey means bear, what we would call bear.
Yeah.
So these new words start out as metaphors, and then they become words once they have like their own category or label. So that's how one way language has evolved over time.
Yeah. So it stacks upon some already defined more fundamental ideas in the language.
Yeah.
And concepts.
Yeah, exactly.
And then maybe some of these metaphors can even be more synergistic, or like it's not just a wolf that likes honey, but maybe there's this new thing, this new combination is something more unique that's more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah. Well, so the point I'm trying to make is it starts out as a metaphor, as an attempt to describe something. And then once it becomes a separate category, it becomes a word, right? The name of a thing is a word or a label. And that's like forward, like metaphors evolving language forward in time as we discover more concepts or creatures or things. We initially use a metaphor to describe it. And then if we can, we crystallize a new specific word or label. What's fascinating is that we also do this backwards in time. And so I typically will use mathematical metaphors because that's my discipline. That's what I know. So when I'm trying to communicate that, I'll talk about math as a metaphor, and I'll do it backwards in time because I might use it to describe something like language, right? So language in time came before math, but I'm using, I guess that would be a forward metaphor. Or our friend Joe, right? Or sorry, mentioning names. We have many friends who like poker. Jimmy, who will hopefully be on the podcast soon, he frequently uses poker metaphors to describe things.
Yes.
Because that's his world. And we're in this weird situation where people will use like internet metaphors to describe very basic things. So one example is like the story of the Matrix, right? This is saying like, what if we lived in a simulation? And, but now it's going in reverse. Like if you want to describe to a kid, how social networking might work in terms of human interaction, you might say, well, it's kind of like getting a friend on Facebook. Right. So you're using a metaphor of a technology they know to go back in time and describe like a basic human skill that they might not have learned.
Yeah. To me, it sounds like I always think of things in terms of my own metaphor, I guess.
Yeah.
Brain information processing, let's say, or like thought processes. So like a schema is like a structural, how a certain structure exists between different nodes or players or entities. And there's a certain way where, this node has these characteristics and interacting in such and such a way. So like this poker metaphor would be like taking something in that's not poker related and plugging it into the poker schema that you have an understanding of the structure of how the poker game works.
Yeah.
And then an alternate input coming in, and okay, if this input was going through this schema, what would that look like?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that could be a way to think about how the mind could cross-wire things. That's like, and that's a thing that I bring up a lot. It's kind of like you have some network that's specialized to do something, but if you just cross-wire something, you can get some strange things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like when the visual cortex is getting auditory input and you start seeing colors or something.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you have a poker computer that you understand very well, and something else comes in that reminds you. So you fit it into that. You generalize.
Yeah. And so metaphors are a very important tool in terms of communication. And it's a very important tool historically in terms of understanding the evolution of language. And humans have a tendency to assume the metaphor is the thing. So someone might metaphorically describe something, but then mistake it for the thing. So for example, I might say math is like a language, and then they might take the metaphor a little too far and say, well, what are the words? Where's the grammar?
Right.
Oh, that's like a language. I'm not saying it's exactly a language.
Yeah. So you want to get them in the ballpark of kind of where to start to think about this, and maybe it'll help understand it rather than just starting too rigidly. Start off with something that or they already have a foundation with.
Right. So there's a huge potential for miscommunication if one person is describing a metaphor and the other person is imagining a fact.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like this, two ships crossing in the night problem.
Yeah.
So it's a powerful tool for communication. You just want to be careful how you use it.
Yeah. 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 I think it also helps open up ideas like these metaphors, but it's not claiming some specific argument. Or
Yeah.
in a lot of cases.
Well, and what's so cool about art and poetry, and someone has like a really exquisite sensitivity to words, like they'll find the exact metaphor and you say, oh yes, that's it. That's so perfect.
Yeah. Okay, then I have another question. So talking about language, talking about like maybe early starting language, metaphors seem like a more complex thing you put on top when you already have some ideas of they're trying to combine previous ideas. But then how about like just a symbol or something that's representative, right? So maybe we get symbols first and then we start combining symbols into metaphors. So what's the difference between, I guess my question is, what's the difference between a symbol and a metaphor?
It's a great question. And in fact, there's a whole field of study called semiotics. And what they study is what exactly is a symbol and, how do you derive meaning? So one school holds that words are actually symbols because symbols convey meaning in a compact sense. So in the sense that we're talking about, the bee wolf is a metaphor attempting to describe something, and then you get Beowulf as like the label. At that point, it becomes a word, but that word is a symbol for the actual being of a bear.
Yeah. Okay, I'm trying to even go.
So they use the word representative, like you're trying to represent something. So that's one definition of a symbol. Like it represents something, and there's also the second definition is that there's a sort of hologram. Although I don't like that word either. But this idea of like a zip file where you take a lot of information and you compact it into something.
Right. So you were saying symbols being words, but I'm trying to go back even more fundamentally. Like the letter A literally just means this vocalization ah, right? So that's a symbol for ah. It has no like meaning above that.
So I would call that a denotation. Like
not a symbol.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So when you're doing like a one-to-one representation, that's notation, right? You're denoting.
Yeah.
You're denoting something.
Is this coming from your math
partly
metaphor?
but also music, right?
Yeah.
So you have these notes, and one of my slides I show in the beginning of my class, I showed this sheet music, and I put it up in front of the class and I say, "Is this music?" And people go, "Oh yeah, that's definitely music. There's the G clef and the notes, so that's definitely music." My answer is no, that's not music. Music is sound. Music is something you hear and experience. This notation represents music, It
Right.
tells you how to play music, but it's not the experience of music.
Right. Right. And you just have such a association with those symbols and the concept of music. There's basically no line. It's like the same thing in people's minds.
Yeah, and I would say it's music notation
Yeah.
because you're representing something in it, you're capturing something in the notation.
Yes. Yes.
Now, if you wanted to symbolize music, most people would use like a note, like an emoji, like a couple of notes moving around, and that like represents music or symbolizes it without giving an actual song and without being precise notation.
Okay. So then there's notation, which we could say. Okay, so that's getting more into the written language. So that's a whole nother interesting thing. Maybe we should just start maybe more in the spoken language and where we were going down with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we use metaphors. We have sentences.
Words.
Words are important. Got to use your words. So is language unique to the human species? Do you think?
Yes. So one of my favorite books is The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. I highly recommend this book. So Steven Pinker is a cognitive scientist. He's currently at Harvard, and he's written a ton of books. This one takes an analysis of Chomsky's universal grammar and makes it accessible to people. He also makes a very strong case that language is our unique superpower as humans. He says, spiders, they spin webs, and beavers, they build dams. Humans use language. And that's like our superpower that makes us special and unique.
So then maybe defining language, and then so how does that form of communication how is that unique to the human species versus these mating calls back and forth, or other kinds of ways that groups of animals might communicate, even though it's not necessarily through language?
So I think the answer is words, that we use words, and also this idea of grammar, and that there's like a creative play with the grammar, whereas most of these other signals are so technically the order of your language is called syntax, where you have to get the sequence exactly right, otherwise the communication doesn't make any sense. And human grammar, you can play around with it a little, and even if it's a little off, you still kind of get it. Like Yoda speak, strong you will become.
Yeah,
it's like, okay, he's saying you're going to be strong.
Right.
Like you can get that even though the grammar is a little wonky.
Okay, so language maybe is more formalized, maybe a more sophisticated term. So
but also more flexible.
Yeah, extremely flexible. But in as opposed to like caveman talk, or if I was trying to communicate with someone who doesn't speak English and I don't speak their language, we might start using gestures or like I'm hungry or something, or if you want to say something's dead.
Right.
These are more like symbols than language. It's communication, but it's not the same level of sophistication of like this object performed some action and this was the result. So there's more like a more interesting causal link that language is trying to convey, maybe.
Yeah, and I really like this idea of uniqueness. For example, this conversation that's occurring has never occurred in human history, because I'm using my words in a unique combination and you're responding in a unique way. And that sort of art and creativity, uniqueness, is something that's really special and part of the language, or a side effect of using language.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm just trying to say is humans are capable of communication, non-language communication, just like animals are, and we can
like the
get by
body language stuff.
Yeah. But then there's this words, right? So then I always think of examples as a neuroscientist. There's cases where some part of the brain or some part of the system that is integral to word language is dysfunctional.
Yeah.
Then the question is, can that person communicate in the same way that we might think?
Yeah.
If they can't hear, for example, they're deaf. I mean, there's all sorts of crazy sign language, and they're obviously communicating in really interesting ways.
Yeah.
So
one thing this book points out that I really like is it goes both ways. So you could have somebody who has like brain damage, but their grammar and language is perfect. And it's like, how does that happen? And one answer is, well, your brain automatically structures language in a generative way, right? You're creating language as you talk. And so even if you have brain damage and you're not like rationalizing things, you can construct and create these utterances that are unique and coherent.
Okay. So you're talking about like the Broca's and Wernicke's areas?
I'm not sure of the biology. I just know there are people who have severe brain damage who are maybe like idiot savants, like maybe, really low levels of functioning, who are able to just talk coherently. And so that the inference that's made is that there's some separate part of the brain that's doing the languaging that's not necessarily connected with intelligence or higher processing, and vice versa. There are people who are perfectly alert, coherent, but they just don't, the words just don't come out.
Yeah.
So the fact that you can have both ways, where like you can have brain damage and be completely coherent, or you can be mute and struggle with the words, but still have like conscious thoughts and like be perfectly intelligent. I think of people like, Stephen Hawking. It's like, the dude's smart. He's having trouble speaking. So these are like separate, they seem integrated. Like for you and I right now, they seem to be the same.
Right.
But there've been, messing around and all the permutations.
Right. Well, for Stephen Hawking, his brain is working, I wouldn't say perfectly, but extremely well. His muscles got disconnected from the control of his brain.
Yeah.
But everything else is still working up there. But the other example I was going to make is that there are specialized areas for different forms of language. One is like to be able to produce utterances that's Broca's area, which is more in the frontal part of the left hemisphere. And that region is really important for actually making the muscle movements and preparing of how I'm going to communicate to you. Whereas Wernicke's is in the temporal lobe, and it's more associated with hearing. And that one is comprehension, so of understanding what I'm hearing. And those two things have reciprocal connections back and forth. So while you can like conceptualize these things as different, like thinking of language, producing language, they all have this feedback loop that feeds on into themselves. So,
one other thing to point out, and Picker makes a solid argument that we have a critical period of language acquisition.
Yes.
I think it's between like 2 and 4 years old, something like that, where we just soak up language like a sponge, and it's effortless. I mean, it seems to take effort, but if you just put a young human being in an environment with language, they'll absorb the language.
Yeah.
And that further speaks to the fact that this is like deeply ingrained in our biology. Like it's an instinct for us to do this. Now, that being said, that we can learn languages after that. It takes more conscious effort. And all these other things that we're pointing to as language analogies are actually skills that are built off the scaffolding of language. So things like math, things like music, programming languages, like the language of science, like all of these things take effort to learn. We don't just absorb these when we're young.
And maybe the language of science, maybe it's like the ideas of science, ideas of math, because I think language is something a little different that we're.
Well, I know. I'm using it as an analogy.
Yeah, metaphor analogy.
Yes.
What's an analogy, by the way? That's another.
So an analogy is meant to be more direct and like a one-to-one comparison to make a point. And a metaphor can be a little more imagistic. Yeah, a little more imagistic and like intuitive, like the gist of it.
Right. Okay, so to go back a little bit, just a little more brain stuff. So you talked about like, the critical period of language maturation between like 2 and 4.
Yeah.
So I like the really fundamental building blocks and how those come about. So language requires the ability to hear and perceive sounds in a coherent manner, and then also to produce things. So babies, even I don't even as young as like 3 months old, or there's some really young age when they just start kind of doing babbling.
Yeah.
And they're like dee ba da and dee da, and it's just getting this fundamental like these pathways going, even though it makes no sense. But they're just like, I'm doing something. It just comes out as total random chaos. I'm hearing it. I'm hearing other people say things, and you start from even that stage. I think developing these things.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about the babbling is, my understanding is that babies have the capacity for every phoneme, meaning like phonics is the sounds you make. So they have this universal capacity for every phoneme. And then as you grow into your language and you move past the developmental period, it's like your brain cuts down on the ones that you don't use and like solidifies the ones that you do use.
Yeah.
That's why when people try to speak foreign languages, they might have trouble with certain letters or vowels or sounds that they just didn't have when they were growing up.
Absolutely. And to also say there's this whole hypothesis with deprivation, sensory deprivation during early or neglect or something. If an infant, a very young infant, even when they're in this like cooing and wooing baba, if you don't have people talking to them or interacting with them, they, I think, have a much higher likelihood of having deficits in language as they progress. So setting up even those initial things before they start making words is really important. And so there's a lot of things now where you're trying to do this environmental enrichment and stimulation and playing music. And the other thing too is like if a baby can push a button and hear a sound, they start making other kinds of thought connections and associations.
Yeah, so I'll try to link it in the description if I can find it. I was listening to this video by Rick Beato. So he's a music instructor, and he makes videos describing like the musicology and like the science behind music. And he's always been into music and like been a music teacher. And it turns out his son developed perfect pitch, where he could hear a note and know exactly what the note was.
It's like 1 in 100,000, or there's a really low percentage of people who can do that reliably.
Yeah, and what he was theorizing is that because he was always surrounded by music during his critical period of development, he actually came up with names for each of these notes in the same way that you'd absorb language and like give words and names to things in your environment.
Yeah.
And he's theorizing that if you do that with your kids, you expose them to not only music but complicated music that like stretches their mind and like, what is that, and like focuses in on it. That like exercise of like trying to understand complicated music at the same time that your brain is like primed to absorb language gives you this perfect pitch and like insight into musical patterns, not just language patterns but musical patterns.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so crucial that early development stuff and just being exposed to things. Because if you're not exposed to different kinds of things, how are you ever going to derive or make connections or associations, causation kind of thoughts in your mind if you don't have that raw data coming in? Now, I don't know. There probably is studies where you can overstimulate children and you adding too much noise maybe. So maybe there's a sweet spot. I don't know what that is, but it probably looks something like natural human evolution in their environment and how they grew up. But I always thought the development aspect was really crucial. And I think I also mentioned, I think I was talking to you earlier today, but like Noam Chomsky, right? He has his innate language idea. But I forgot what he called it. He called it like
Universal grammar.
Universal grammar. But there was also something. It was called like a language acquisition device. It was the term he used for how the innateness of language is encoded in humans, and it's not that humans are just out of the get-go gonna speak. It just means that their brain networks and genes that allow for these networks to be set up are present. So it's like, I don't want to get too much into this like blank slatey kind of idea, but the blank slate is actually a structure and some preset network that's ready to get programmed. And that is pretty universal across people. Mm-hmm. Then the question is, and why I brought this up, is during development, the more you put input into this pre-set up network is going to determine how it will be functioning in the future and how you acquire language and associations. But it's already primed. It's already kind of influenced to behave a certain way. But it's not dictating exactly how things are going to go. Mm-hmm. Which I think makes a lot of sense. Because when I first hear like innate grammar, like innate language, it's like, okay, that circuit is like, let's go buy the Intel chip and put it in our brain. Everyone has that same exact chip, and it's just hardwired. But what's hardwired is the capacity to program the network, which is a slightly different take on it. Mm-hmm. But I think it's an important one to keep in mind when we talk about nature versus nurture. Mm-hmm. Nature provides the ability for the nurture to occur. Mm-hmm.
So in Jungian language, language is an archetype. So an archetype is like a place in the psyche where something goes, and something that's archetypal goes into the place. So it's like you have a socket and a peg. So like there's a place in the brain for language, and then whatever you're exposed to is the peg that goes in the socket.
Okay, and then those pegs and sockets have similarities across people and cultures. And
right. So there's like a language hole, and depending on where you are, you get something in that hole. And then there's the mother socket, and depending on your personal mother, that goes in the socket. So very interesting ideas.
Yeah, and I think it's just a general concept, I think, in developmental neuroscience too. So we're just talking about language, but like you said, there's other sockets for different things, like the visual system and motor coordination and thought. That's another interesting thing where I believe, I don't know who it was, but words are actually analogous to thought. Not metaphor. They're actually the same. Yeah. It's like...
So there's a book, I was talking about this earlier before we started the podcast, called The Stuff of Thought. And also by Steven Pinker. And in that book, he talks about how language is the stuff of thought. And one idea is that thinking is language. Now, as a mathematician, I protest. I think you can think mathematically and geometrically. It doesn't necessarily have to be language, but for most people, instinctually, language is the stuff of thought. And there's a fascinating theory. It's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And this takes this idea to the extreme, which says you are only capable of thinking what you have words to think. So it's saying that it takes this idea that language is thought. Therefore, if you don't have language, you can't think something. Now, there are counter arguments to this.
That seems pretty extreme.
It is pretty extreme. And there are definitely counter arguments to that and evidence. But the intuition is there's some things, like if you learn foreign languages, there's some things and phrases that exist in that language that you just can't translate. And like you can write a sentence or two to try to describe one word in another language just because that idea in that word doesn't exist in a language.
Right. Then you have to come up with all these metaphors and huge sentences just to get that idea, which maybe doesn't exist in its true form in that other language.
Yeah, for sure. And so the amended Sapir-Whorf is something like language is part of culture, and there are like cultural assumptions. So it's not that you don't have the capacity to think those things. It's just it takes extra time and translation.
Yeah.
And there are also things like math and music and images and geometries. There are different ways of thinking and processing that aren't necessarily words.
Yeah. So maybe even like different languages will give you a different lens on how you think about things.
Oh yeah, no, for sure, 100%. Languages
Reg-
expand your mind.
yeah, but regardless of like the culture, I mean, it's probably hard to separate the language and cultures, but like if you could totally separate them, I would imagine the way that you go about solving problems or thinking about things in the world or doing your work will be dependent on the kind of grammatical language structure that you've set up in your head.
It can be like, so one silly example is, German is an aggressive language. That's why Germans are aggressive.
Aggressive.
It's like, well, aggression is pretty universal among humans, so I
Yeah.
don't think that's true. Um, but I do think people make emotional associations with words. This is a big part of poetry, is when you say house versus home, right? One house is kind of a neutral description of a building. Home has this emotional connotation.
Yeah. Right.
And those connotations come with culture, not
Right.
just the meaning, but like the feeling of it.
Yeah.
And that's also the source of poetry, right? In poetry, you're playing around with these feelings and emotions in an appealing way.
Yeah. And not only that, let's just go back with another recursive loop. It's very simplex. The environment in which these cultures originate from can often drive what kind of words or how many words they have for certain things.
Oh yeah, for
So
sure.
like the Inuit have like 100 words for snow because there's all sorts of different, or ice or something like that. Because there's all sorts of different. I wouldn't be able to even comprehend it because I don't have the word for it or the experience.
Yeah, so it's fascinating because, and I was trying to talk about this the other day, is like in Egypt, they're describing hell. And so they have this demon of the underworld that devours souls, and it's a crocodile.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you go to like Norse mythology, this demon of the underworld is either a snake or a wolf. It's like, well, because there are alligators in Egypt and crocodiles in Egypt, and there are wolves and snakes in Norway.
And what's up with all this like red-skinned horned devils coming out of Europe? I don't know anything like that.
I think the red skin is kind of a new thing.
Okay.
But
dragons, maybe? That's like kind of a reptile dinosaur.
Yeah.
Those kind of monsters and beasts.
Yeah, but the point is, people are trying to describe something metaphysical, and they're using a local metaphor to describe like a metaphysical, psychological place.
Totally.
And this is why, like, I really appreciate a lot of Joseph Campbell's work or Carl Jung's work. So he's assuming, or they're assuming, that humans have this universal psychology, and they use the tools and the metaphors that are around them to communicate things. And at the root of it, we all have this shared sort of spirituality. We just have a different language, different symbols and metaphors for communicating these shared experiences.
Right. So there's a core essence of something, but then we each, through our development and our life experiences, kind of have some amorphous thing around those core things that might be slightly biased one way or the other in how things work. But there's still that core archetypal structure that we all share.
That's the idea.
Right. Okay, I think we got a little sidetracked. We were talking about language.
We were talking about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, how language is thought, and then the extreme of idea is that if you don't have the words, you can't think something.
Right.
And the counter argument is no. Usually, what happens is people encounter something new, and then they create language to describe the new thing.
Yes. That seems more intuitive to me. Because I'm, again, thinking about like these young kids, and they press a button, they hear a sound. Or, we have some nieces, some young nieces, and when they were playing with their toys, I forget which one it was, but she'd pick up the car and put it on the track, and it would like roll down. She'd pick up the car, put it on the track, and do just again and again. It was just fascinated. And there was I don't think there was any language going on up there, but the causal association of I'm doing this and something's happening. Understanding the world, and then after like you start making these associations, then these words become useful to try to convey whatever experience I just had with someone else, and back and forth. So yeah, language is like it's a shell on top of the the hardware going on underneath.
Mhm.
Almost think of it as like a software, like a second level software above the operating system or something.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Yeah. Computer languages too, right? Binary, like we don't speak binary, we speak C++ or something.
Mhm.
Binary is kind of like all this unconscious stuff we don't get, and this higher level language which we can use to communicate is a little more sophisticated.
Do you remember the Next Generation, Star Trek The Next Generation episode where they go to this planet and they say things like Damak and Jalan?
Yes. Yes.
And the whole thing was just about their culture just uses metaphors only. That's all they use in their language.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because in Star Trek they have this universal translator, which you could imagine being like, Chomsky's universal grammar. And like it was picking up the words that they were using, but there was this like, I don't know what the meaning is behind these words.
Yeah. I'd like to know how they built rocket ships and got faster than light travel with metaphoric language only. Or maybe their civilization used that and then their culture changed and now they only speak in metaphors.
Yeah, maybe.
I shouldn't dissect science fiction too much. But anyways, I think it's important to have some structure when you're trying to do these really complicated engineering tasks.
For sure. Well, and that's what I was talking about before, where science is like a meta language or a more sophisticated and precise language beyond the natural language.
Mm-hmm.
Like scientific words have a very specific meaning, and they're precise tools that you use in that discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing with law, right? Legal language is very specific and precise.
Yeah.
To contracts, and like math notation that's very specific and precise for math, and psychology uses very specific terminology for things in that discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one that's fascinating to me is philosophy. And so if you read some high level philosophy, it's like, okay, I understand these individual words,
right?
But this sentence does not make sense to me.
There's like literally 3 pages, and all they're trying to make is like one simple point, but they got to like cover every single possible outcome. Yeah, it's important when you're trying to really get down to the root of things.
Yeah, specialized language for sure.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Now, where would you like to go next with this? Because I have some ideas I'd like to talk about contextual dependent language, but I think that might be higher up. Why don't we go to writing?
Okay.
Some of the what's the earliest form of writing? It's like
Pictographs, like cave paintings. Well, so in the evolution, you have like pictures, and then you have what they call ideograms, and this is similar to like Chinese writing or like the hieroglyphic system, where you could like the hieroglyphic system is more transitional in that you can see, okay, like there's a plant, there's like a leaf here, or there's a hand, there's an eye, and then you have this. Hieroglyphs are weird because it's kind of it's this weird transitional language or notation.
Well, it has like sounds in it, but it's also direct pictographs.
And the pictographs turn into metaphors too.
Okay.
And same thing with Chinese. Like you have these characters that are like word ideas, but then you have like radical modifiers, and you have like within context it changes the meaning. So it's really complex.
Yeah.
Which I mean, there's a beauty to it, and that's why there's such an extraordinary art in terms of like poetry and calligraphy and whatnot. But there's also this lack of precision, and it isn't until you get the phonetic alphabets where you're just the idea is just like, here's the sound, and we're gonna represent that in a letter, like you're saying A is ah. And then so you get the phonetic alphabet, so the sound translates directly or as directly as possible to letters, and then you encode words that represent sequences of sound. So there's this correspondence between the sound and the writing, and in theory then, if you understand the alphabet, you just read the word on the page and you could hear the word in your mind.
Yeah, right. So another language, I'm obsessed with documentaries. And one of them was, they call it thing, breaking the Mayan code.
Oh, okay.
And they have this huge, so these Mayan things they thought were pictograms, and no one could figure it out after I was like 100 years. They were just totally stumped. and I forgot what the exact thing was, but it turned out that it was like a phonetic language. Like the sounds were in the symbols, but it was like it wasn't necessarily the image that was shown, but it was like the image and where it was on the pictogram. So like if the snake was at the bottom, it means something else. If it was at the top,
Okay.
and then if there was like a feather or whatever, and it basically was like it was still sounds, but the structure and how they represented those things was not very straightforward. And they said what made it even more complicated, like you were just talking about, when you get like it turns into more of like an art or beauty thing, you get calligraphy and stuff. And so a lot of times these Mayans would embellish on some of these letters.
Right.
And it would look beautiful and it would mean something. But if you're an archaeologist trying to understand what the hell they're saying, it makes it really, really tough.
Well, what's really cool, so the Muslims believe that you cannot represent things in images. It's like an idolatry thing. You can't have images.
Oh, yeah.
So their art consists of their language, and their calligraphy is just extraordinary. And like they'll write, the name of God or verses in this elaborate calligraphy. And as an outsider, you're like, wow, that's some cool art. But it's actually words that are stylized in a profound way.
Totally. And so there's a little bit of human nature, like exploration, some of that like amorphous stuff kind of woven into language until you get into the more like philosophy and all that stuff we talked about, where like being rigid and no fluff, just we're trying to be as clear and concise as possible.
Yeah, and then that's when you get people ideally who are coining new words to describe a new concept. And that's what all famous philosophers do, right?
Yeah.
They come up with a new idea. It doesn't really have a word, so they come up with a word.
Right. Well, so honestly, in the back of my mind, I was thinking this very early on when you brought up this book. And I saw meta, and then I saw fours. I'm thinking, I know meta, what's fours? And I'm sure that combination of roots means something.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. So the history of a word is called the etymology, and you can, just like the Beowulf thing, you can trace where these pieces came from, and so maybe four is connected to like phonics, like
right?
sound.
I was thinking sound. It's like a meta sound or a meta idea
or meta meaning.
Yeah, meta meaning maybe, which is cool. Like the word metaphor has its own like metaphor in its writing.
It's very meta.
Very meta. Too much meta for one day. Okay, so we got this writing system, pictographs and cave paintings. They got that famous French cave. They were just drawing pictures, I think. Maybe they were communicating something. Or maybe a hunt. There might be even a story like.
Or some people theorize like a ritual. Like not like a baptism, but like maybe baptism, like rite of passage, where you go into the cave and you have this experience and like.
There was another new cave they just found not too long ago, actually. I think it was in France. You should look it up. It was like a water cave. And for some reason, the water went down and people were able to find it. And they found like cave paintings. They're older than the Cave of Dreams, or whatever they called it. But that's crazy. That's some crazy stuff.
The Cave of Forgotten Wonders.
So writing, it's language, right? But it's symbolic to the words, like the symbols are representing the sounds, and you can write it down. What was the main huge? You're smiling. You got something you want to say?
Oh, I'm just thinking about the ancestors went into the cave. What were they thinking? The remnants of ancient dreams of people long ago.
Werner Herzog, the most profound narrator mankind has ever had the pleasure of experiencing. Yes. And Waldo. Shout out to Joe. Where is Waldo? Anyways. That was fun. But what were we talking about?
I'm glad you got it out of my system.
I saw the pressure building up, so it definitely needed to come out.
We were discussing the mysteries of language.
And the caves. And
in the cave of forgotten dreams.
That's right.
The caves of France. Well, ancestors long ago. Anyways.
Yes, yes. But yeah, so people have been wanting to put these things down on stone or in clay tablets. Anyways, the main point I'm trying to get across is written language or spoken languages have been around for a long time, right? And tradition has often been passed down through narrative stories, word of mouth, that around the campfire or whatever.
Yeah, well, and almost every culture associates that with the sacred, right? So there's sacred language and sacred stories and sacred practices that involve language and chanting. So it's deep. It's old.
It's deep. But then now that there's this technology of putting things down onto a permanent form that will outlive your biological life, has a profound effect on, first, I guess, keeping track of things more accurately. Because if you have word of mouth, right, the story changes, you get this telephone thing, and who knows what the heck the original story was about, or it was like updating. But now that you've got like a concrete way of keeping track of information in a language form, you can essentially have a conversation with Plato, or like Plato. That guy's been dead for a really long time.
Yeah,
that's pretty remarkable when you
it's
think
really
about
cool.
it.
It's like a time capsule, right? This like echoes through time.
Yeah. And I always like to think of things of like general systems. And so now this thing of writing, to me, it's like a long-term storage device. It's like a long-term storage hard drive for mankind that didn't exist before.
So that's what I'm calling a backwards metaphor, right? So
Okay.
you're using a hard drive to describe writing, which is earlier in time.
Yeah.
So it's not a criticism. I'm just pointing out that's what you're doing. You're using the tools of today that most people are familiar with to describe something previously existed.
Right. Well, I started out with like, a hard record that's permanent in stone or something. But then, the common metaphor that's more, I don't know, digestible in the modern age of technology is like a hard drive.
Right.
But having that for like humanity, rather than just your laptop or something.
Well, that's what Wikipedia is, right?
Yeah, that's a digital form of storage. But just that capacity, just that general idea is to have more of a permanence of information, a record.
Yeah.
Like dramatic
YouTube videos might be immortal.
Yeah, and it's out there. It's data. And we mentioned, you have to build on previous ideas to make more complex ones. So there's like some fundamental, you have to make the ba, wa, da sounds, and then you make words. And then with those words, you can have ideas. And with those ideas, you can make metaphors. And it kind of keeps building up. But that's all stuck in between your ears, your brain, until you die. But with a written language, now, some of that can be permanentized. I think that's a major change, and a huge advancement in human civilization.
For sure, yeah, and pros and cons, right? I think I don't remember who it was. It might have been Plato, but he was critical of writing because up until that point, I think this is across almost all cultures that first encounter writing. It's like, look, our most sacred traditions are word of mouth, and this transmission transmission of these sacred stories is an act that's been going on for thousands of years. There's a sort of desecration when you write down the sacred and just duplicate it endlessly.
Yeah.
Like makes it more profane and common.
Right.
And so a lot of people said, hey, you can't.
It's interesting. It downplays the importance of this moment now. If you can store it and bring it back later whenever you want.
Yeah, it's like the idea of a Buddhist sand painting, right? So they create this beautiful work of art and it represents that life is transitory. Like this art will never be made again. It's here and it's gone.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah. Well, I like that.
And then the second thing that's really interesting is the idea that languages change over time. And Latin, which was the language of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Catholic Church has used for thousands of years, is like a fossil in time. Because, Italian, French, Spanish, these languages rooted in Latin have kind of evolved in their own directions.
Mm-hmm.
But Latin, which is now a dead language in the sense it's not evolving, it's like frozen in time.
Yeah. But it's being picked apart and used for all sorts of different words in English and other languages.
And I think part of the reason is if you have a language that's not evolving, it's ideal for something like science or law.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it meant the same thing 2,000 years ago that it means now, so it's unambiguous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now, and so I thought the coolest thing, I didn't realize that there was a pushback against the written language because it somehow desecrates or undermines the importance of the dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're saying, Plato, that was his whole thing, like this dialectic. And with even more modern technology, I've heard stories like when technology of like photographs or photography, I think it was Native Americans were like,
steal your soul.
Do not take a picture of me. This is like some weird stuff going on. Like maybe it's a similar kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and then nowadays we've got everyone taking 1,000 pictures a day, posting on Instagram and Facebook, and it's all the information is there stored on the cloud and petabytes of information freely available to anyone.
Well, yes, back up a little bit.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening is there's also this. So one is like rejection, like this is profane and it's going to mess people up. The other instinct that people do is they make things sacred.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, this writing is like, the common world of contracts and love letters. This writing is sacred.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you get things like sacred texts.
Mm-hmm.
And almost every tradition that has writing very quickly develops sacred writings as opposed to common writings.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I think it's a common reflex for a lot of people is when you somehow like bastardize or dilute something from the original, it just seems so wrong. Like when they do like a remake of some original movie, it's just like, oh, why did you do that? You desecrated the perfect thing, and what a horrible, you should never ever touch that because that had its own thing, and now you've, like I said, bastardized it into some horrible thing. So I think it's just maybe it's a common thing of have some reverence for things that had a great impact on you or was important to you, and maintain that purity. Anyways, just making a metaphor for my personal life versus these kinds of cultural wide phenomenon. All right, so we got language, we got writing. It hasn't really evolved much, like the written form since like the Phoenician times or like Latin or Greek.
Well, yeah. I mean, English is a weird language. Like we take it for granted, but it's really weird. And the reason for that is, there's a book here I haven't read, but I want to read called The Power of Babel by John McWhorter. And he talks about a natural history of language, how languages evolved through time. English, as I understand it, is an amalgam of various languages. So there's like the Welsh kind of Celtic languages that are more or less native to the British Isles. And then you had Germanic invasions. And then you had French invasions. You also had the Roman occupation bringing Latin and Greek. So English is this weird amalgamation between these like native Welsh and Celtic languages, German, French, Latin, and Greek. And that's why the language is so weird, is because of all these strange intermixing of languages. And I was very frustrated as a kid learning language. And like one of the rules was I before E, except after C. It's like, okay.
But except not in some cases.
How do you spell science? Einstein.
Right.
Anyways. So the rules are incoherent, and part of the reason is because you have like 5 or 6 different language systems.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, in the French, because their vowels are weird, this is how you spell in French, and then here's the Latin spelling, and here's the Germanic spelling, and
Right.
so if you understand the combinations and where they're coming from, then it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But you got to understand the history, and to be fair, I think Chinese and Japanese, in terms of writing systems, are a lot more complicated and take a lot more work than English. Maybe not. That would be an interesting study.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of all the technology that has developed since writing. And I guess what I'm trying to say is there hasn't been actually advances of that. There's been advances in like data storage or storing this into like digital space rather than on parchment or stone or clay. But the language itself hasn't changed. And there's probably a couple of reasons for that. I think some scientists try to come up with a more efficient, proper language, this Esperanto thing, which is like, okay, we're going to actively do like a top-down construction of a language that makes efficient use of letters and sounds and structure or something. But that just obviously didn't take off. I don't know, maybe it's because it's not that much more beneficial. But the other thing is maybe our brains are just so wired to do this in this way that you can't mess with it. Like you can't improve the way auditory and language and ideas are transmitted. Elon Musk has this idea. It's like, forget all of these words and stuff. Let's just connect cables to our thought, and then who needs to speak? And we're like in telepathy mode now. So that would be the only thing that's like technology improving on. I guess we just need bypassing language actually. That would be pretty wild.
So linguists, I think, call this mentalese, and it's the idea. The idea is that there's a language of the mind that isn't words, and if we could somehow decode that, then we would have the true universal language.
Yeah. I don't even know if that's considered language in the way that we are putting it out today, which is more of the specific word pattern of things that you symbolize your ideas into those, and then you have that into a thought. So I think it would totally bypass that, but I don't even know what that would look like. It would be weird. Like if I had to imagine, if we had like a brain link of our ideas, I don't think I could necessarily disassociate your ideas from mine. Like it would, the origin of where that's coming from probably would be very ambiguous.
That's a weird thought experiment.
Yes.
I always, so one thought I had was like, if you and I like if you were somehow able to inhabit my consciousness, like, and then go back to yours, you'd have an experience like, you feel like that? Like, you've got this constant pain in your forehead all the time? I never knew that.
Right.
Like, yeah, just live with it, I guess.
To it, right. Yeah. Or being able to hear perfect pitch and be like, WTF is this?
Yeah.
If we like shared brains with that guy or whatever.
Right.
Maybe it's a totally different experience of how things are. Maybe this language is a good safety net so we don't go down some like crazy existential crisis.
Jung said that religion was to protect people from a direct experience of God.
That's intense. That's like some Ark of the Covenant, like Nazi face burning shit.
Exactly. It's like we're gonna give you this in layers for your own good, right? For your own protection,
right?
Like in theory, it would be a cool experience, but is that what you really want?
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. But I think we're stuck with language for a long time. I think it's useful. I think it's fascinating. I think it's interesting. I do think it shapes the way we think. Definitely, that's how I think. Often it helps me to write things down, and it helps me solidify ideas to do that, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And it's not like I'm writing it to anyone. I'm just taking notes and just thinking about it.
Yeah.
And it's just making this back and forth network activate. And then, yeah.
And I also think, symbolically at least, it's powerfully transformational. Like that process is how you grow and learn and change. And symbolically, right, Hermes or Mercury was the messenger of the gods.
Mm-hmm.
And he to me symbolizes communication
Mm-hmm.
in a mythological sense,
Mm-hmm.
the transformative power of communication.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the Judeo-Christian tradition, right, the Logos, the incarnate word of God, has this power to heal and has this power to transform.
Mm-hmm. And language is able to do that as well.
Well, Logos is another way of saying language. It actually is a Greek
Greek logic.
Well, it's the root word for logic.
Oh, okay. I see. Interesting. See, here I thought they were just interchangeable.
Well, words are tricky, man, because
Yeah.
they have multiple meanings and these meanings change over time.
Right. Crazy. And you know what's also crazy? All right, so now I'm going to get back a little more into some like brain perception stuff. So not only is it just how to understand language, the structure of language, how we use it back and forth, but you can actively change the way you interpret or understand a language based on context. Whatever your internal state is, your external state. If there's noise, you can literally hear something different than, or your top-down expectation can actually dramatically influence what you are hearing or understanding.
The Laurel Yanny thing.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just like one word change, right? Or green needle and brainstorm.
Yeah.
That same thing.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll get my phone later, and then maybe we can.
Or we can
play
link it. We can link it.
We can link it. Okay. But just okay. So that's just the concept of it's the exact same sound, but if you're thinking, oh, you and I are sitting down and we're gonna, and then play the sound, brainstorm, or like, oh, you know, my grandmother has a sewing kit and my sock has a hole and she's gonna use her green needle. It's like if you just that's what you hear because that's what makes sense.
Yeah.
But it's literally the exact same
Sound.
Yeah. So you could also think of that in terms of if you hear a story or in a communication with someone, if you're like in a positive mood, you might have a positive interpretation on the things that they're trying to say. Or if you're in a negative mood, you're going to have a much more negative idea of what that same string of words means.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess what I'm saying is that I love these feedback loops, and that there is some basic structure of like a word structure and word sentences, but what you're anticipating and the state of mind you're in, your emotional state, can all influence that input coming in. It can prime it in a certain way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I just think that's fascinating, and it's the more we try to contain these ideas and get them rigided and structured, the more like interconnectivity there is, and the more influences from sources we didn't expect exist. Mm-hmm. Or like when there's like ideas, you're thinking about a concept thing. So probably when you're the most blank and just not really thinking about much, or maybe you are, depends on the person, but you're in the shower, right? That's when everyone's like, I was in the shower and then I just thought of this thing and just like, whoa, eureka. Mm-hmm. And it's probably because when you're in the shower, you're in this more like relaxed, lucid, you're not like focused on anything, and maybe a connection can jump out in your thought or language process that doesn't usually get there. Mm-hmm. So that's just like a state dependent thing that can give different access to different ideas. And therefore, if ideas are language, it's connected all the way down.
Yeah, I mean, it's this weird blur between like language, metaphor, image, and sensation, and yeah.
And then if we go back to the very beginning, setting up this innate or having this innate network that's ready to receive input and program itself to do all of these things and become more sophisticated as it's developing. Mm-hmm. And then communicating with others to develop those things further. It's awesome. It's awesome. I think language is really cool. I think I would like to explore the idea of how like things in nature communicate and how intricate that is. And I think language, I don't know, maybe maybe there could be some language in some of those more basic things like I was mentioning. And that'd be something I'd like to look into. Maybe I'll look up some resources and we can circle back to this conversation in the future.
Yeah.
Cool.
That do it for today.
I think so, unless you got any other cool language ideas or concepts.
Many, but I think your idea of circle back later is probably good.
Cool. Well, I guess thanks for listening.
Make sure you like and subscribe. If you have any interesting ideas, be sure to comment and we will make an effort to respond.
Yeah. And information in the description. Thanks, everyone.